I'm big non-Luka, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I am unfortunately not joined here by my co-host, Jaron, as he is unable to make this podcast. But nonetheless, today we're going to be getting into the Mavericks 124-122 debilitating loss to the Indiana Pacers. One of probably the more thought-provoking losses that any Mavs fan came away with after this one, because I mean, there's just a lot of bad thoughts emanating in a lot of our heads right now, to say the least. It was a very just weakening and sort of heartbreaking loss, not in the sense of, I mean, yes, of how close it was, but just the overall consensus of the team and the general feeling around it. This team sorely needs a sort of invigoration of energy or something. And I think that regardless of what any fans think the exact issues of this Mavericks teams are, they can all agree that they need an invigoration of energy and spirit, because at times it does tend to look quite dead. But I mean, today, nonetheless, we'll of course be getting into this game, but also just, is the Mavericks season in jeopardy? I know that seems a little bit like a far-fetched just based off one game, but this is obviously taking in counts of, countless amount of games this year, and analyzing the ways in which the Mavericks have lost, their clutch time woes, and the whole Kyrie thing, and just the simple fact that the Mavericks only have 19 games left in this season. They are now 32-31, and I mean, there's cause for concern that they may not even hit the 41 win mark or the 500 mark. So there's a lot to get into with this one, to say the least. I'm obviously treading carefully when I say that the Mavericks season could potentially be in jeopardy. I'm not necessarily saying that it is, but it is noteworthy to at least pose the question, I would presume, right? And at least, kind of sift through why it may or may not be, because I mean, this along, ever since when Kyrie's got traded here, they've been 1-4 since Kyrie and Luka started playing together. But I mean, it's just been a little rough stretch of games from them, and it's at a very bad time. That's not to say that the Kyrie-Luka pairing is not working or anything like that, but I mean, there's definitely cause for concern in terms of the Mavericks how they may fare this season. But we'll be getting all into that. But of course, before we do that, here's an ad from our sponsor, Anchor. All right, guys, so getting into this one, before we even start the game, let's go ahead and get into Maxi Kleber's return. So after missing about 2.5 months, Maxi Kleber returned after tearing his right hamstring, and actually played, given the circumstances, pretty well in, I believe, about 24 minutes. He actually ended up closing the game just due to some issues regarding Christian Wood being in foul trouble, Dwight Powell not necessarily being the most tailor-made aid to stopping Miles Turner, if to say the absolute least. I think that Jason Kidd's hand was kind of forced a little bit in this one to play Maxi, even though he was on a preconceived minutes restriction that was undisclosed before the game. And, Maxi by all means was not a cure-all. He was not some sort of godsend that alleviated all this team's defensive issues. I think that that's well documented, because I know a lot of people were out with the agenda before Maxi came back that he was like the final piece to this team, and like all the defensive issues would kind of just like fade away as soon as he got here. And I mean, he definitely helps aid in that department, and he helps alleviate some stress, but he is not the cure-all or the final piece to all this team's defensive issues. I want to dispel that narrative, because at the end of the day, he is, I believe, 31 years old. And on top of that, he has a track record of leg injuries, and he's just not a guy that's going to be sustainable to be able to play this heavy dosage of minutes and starter level minutes night in, night out. He's a good contributor as a role player, but he's not a guy that simply has like the wherewithal to, play starter level minutes and bang up against these, top rim protectors night in and night out. He's not that big. He's a really good weak side shot blocker. He's a great rotational defender. Occasionally he can anchor down on some of those bigger centers, as well as switch on at the perimeter. But if you're asking him to sort of mend to all these issues in one game, that's when questions present themselves in terms of how, sustainable that's going to be for him. And but nonetheless, I thought he played great in his debut for what it's worth. He hit a three, he attacked off a closeout and had a dunk that got the bench really hyped. And he just played some really sound basketball. I thought he played great rotationally on defense. He was matched up against Myles Turner one-on-one, especially in the waning moments of the second half at times. And I mean, he did about as good as he could have. He forced Myles Turner to having to hit some, fall away jumpers on him, which Myles Turner inevitably actually ended up making more than he missed. But I mean, you'd rather him take those shots than those little like push shots with inside 8 feet that Christian Wood and Dwight Powell weren't able to defend, or, they weren't able to fare as good in pick and roll coverage on those Haliburton and Myles Turner pick and rolls. And it's wildly impressive that Maxi, having not played in however long, was able to do so good in those minutes where he had to defend that pick and roll. So, I mean, I thought he played a hell of a game on both sides of the ball. You could definitely tell that the explosion was maybe not there, that there was a hindrance there in terms of the lateral quickness and the athleticism, but he just stayed very stout. And in terms of the limitations that his body may be providing on him, I thought he played good. So when he fully gets up to speed, I think he's going to be a huge cog in the Mavericks rotation. So I'm very excited for that much. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get into the game, because there are a lot of different things to get into with this one. Before we start getting into some narratives regarding the game, I just want to go ahead and kind of cover it sequentially and just look at it kind of like on a quarter by quarter basis, because this definitely was one of those games that I feel like there's, those sort of like stories that are inept to certain parts of this game. This was a game that was not necessarily maybe a game of runs, but it was definitely a game of momentum changing, if that makes any sense. And, we saw a little bit of a contrast between Rick Carlisle and Jason Kidd in terms of their timeout calling from that aspect. Rick Carlisle, he's always quick to stop a run, if he sees one on the horizon. We saw that with his time in Dallas. I failed to mention it, of course, but this was his second game returning to the AAC as the head coach of the Pacers. So, there were a few times that the Mavericks seemed as if they were about to go on a run, and Carlisle seemingly halted it by calling a timeout. And Kidd, he's more along the lines of letting his guys run, letting his guys play, trying to let them fight through adversity, which, I mean, occasionally does have its benefits. And, your team can definitely grow from that a lot more than having, their play halted and things of that nature. But more often than not, it will tend to, let the issue or whatever is happening with a given team, when you don't call a timeout, it'll let that issue sort of turn into something bigger than it is. And, that definitely has been cause for concern from a lot of Mavericks fans in terms of Jason Kidd's non-timeout calling, if you will. But nonetheless, it wasn't anything that I think severely hindered the Mavericks in this game or anything like that. But I did think it was a noteworthy point that I wanted to point out. But nonetheless, regarding the actual game, I know I've said that twice, but regarding the actual game, to start off the game, I thought Myles Turner and Tyrese Haliburton exploited the Mavericks in the pick and roll, as I had kind of alluded to. Haliburton is just such a master with, his hesitation dribbles and his crossover. I mean, he's extremely quick. His season this year, of course, has been extremely impressive. And his ability to change pace and probe in the pick and roll was no match for Dwight Powell, to say the least. And, whether it was the Mavericks trying to switch the pick and roll too late, or Dwight Powell, or, that point of attack ball defender just kind of being too indecisive in terms of what to do on some of those Haliburton and Turner pick and rolls. It was more often than not leading to a lot of Turner wide open push shots or, lobs at the rim. And when they deferred to the pick and pop, the Mavericks just simply didn't have the wherewithal to stop it. The Mavericks did a little bit better job of rotating a guy over from the weak side to stop those Turner pick and rolls. But when he started making threes, Miles Turner, that is, it was extremely hard to stop from the Mavericks perspective, especially when it was one of Wood or Powell having to guard him head up. And the Mavericks did run there were a few instances tonight where they ran some two big lineups. And I thought that they actually fared quite well defensively, whether it, be Wood and Maxi specifically, which I thought did the best. And, there were a couple of times Wood and Powell got together out there that they didn't do too bad either. Because, just from a perspective of being able to rotate one of those guys over when you have, such a dynamic roller in Miles Turner, he obviously wasn't coming into the league known for his rim rolling, but he's evolved into this sort of multi-dimensional offensive center. And it's been joyous to watch just from an NBA perspective, the way the guy plays the game. It's, he's a hell of a player. And I really wish he was on our team, to say the least, especially with, how good he is defensively, probably being one of the best shot blockers and rim protectors in the league. But nonetheless, that was absolutely killing the Mavericks in terms of that Haliburton-Turner pick and roll. I believe Turner had like 8 points to start the first 8 points for the Pacers. He had to start the game. But the Mavericks were able to remediate some of that pick and roll game from the Pacers by Luka just simply scoring at all three levels in this one. He finished with 39 points, but he was just doing a great job tapping into his post game in this one. There were a lot of instances where Kyrie or Josh Green, when he got in there, would bring the ball off, and they'd run Luka off down screens to get him the ball. That is one of the benefits of having Kyrie on this team, is you have the ability to not use. The Mavericks haven't really necessarily tapped into using Luka off ball to the degree that they could, but they have the ability to run some different actions that doesn't involve Luka having to bring the ball up the court and ISO the whole possession. He can get the ball in different spots. When you get the ball to him in the post with a successful entry pass, or, you get the ball with him on the wing with a favorable matchup, if, if the Mavericks got a favorable switch, those can lead to a lot of different good things. And it can also save Luka from expelling as much energy. So I thought he did an excellent job tonight, taking advantages of mismatches, operating in the mid-range, getting to those post-ups. And, when he got a big or somebody more slow-footed on him, he did a good job just simply blowing past guys and, using his combination of strength and quickness to get to the rim. And he did a good job, like when the double team was coming, diagnosing if he needed to split it, if he needed to pass out of it, create that 4-on-3 scenario. And there were even a couple times, I love when Luka does this, when there's a trap coming from whichever side it's coming from, he attacks the weak side and he gets to the rim. He did that like once or twice tonight. So he did a great job scoring on all three levels. His step back was going in a little bit tonight, probably a little more efficient than it typically does. He ended up going well through. I say that, and then I look at the box score. He ended up going 3 for 9, but there were particularly in that first half, it definitely seemed like it was dropping a little bit more. But I guess it kind of veered off a little bit. But nonetheless, excellent game from him. He was really what kept the Mavericks just up and going in that first half, and gave them the ability to compete against the Pacers in that first half. Otherwise, the Pacers shot very well from 3 in that first half. And I think the spacing and the Mavericks having to rotate guys over from the weak side to stop that Haliburton-Turner pick and roll was part of the reason that the Pacers were seemingly getting so many open threes. Aaron Nesmith, who only played 18 minutes in this game, it seemed like a whole lot more, or 19 minutes rather. He went 2 for 4 from 3. Miles Turner went 1 for 2 from 3. Haliburton went 2 for 6 from 3, but those were mostly above the break threes that he, was shooting at the point of attack. When a guy goes under on a screen or something like that, those weren't necessarily catch and shoot threes. Buddy Hield went 1 for 1. Jordan Nwora went 3 for 4. I felt like all three of those were in the first half. The Pacers as a team tonight only finished, I believe, 12 of 37 from the 3-point line. Or no, 11 of 28, my mistake. They only finished 11 from 28. The Mavericks were 12 for 37. But they were shooting the lights out in the first half. And they ended up finishing the first half with 69 points. I have that right? Yes, they ended up finishing the first half with almost 70 points in this one. And, they did bear some negative shooting regression in that second half, but as you can obviously see attributed to the box score, but they, really got going by virtue of their spacing in that first half. And that definitely served as a hindrance to the Mavericks' ability to keep pace with them. No pun intended. The Mavericks probably could have been a little more stout defensively in that first half, but I will say that the Pacers were getting a lot of foul calls and the Mavericks were overfouling quite a bit. A lot of that also, there were a couple sort of ticky-tacky calls that I thought could have been, conducive to the referees, as kind of like in that Lakers game, but it definitely wasn't as prominent. A lot of it, I think, just had to do with the Mavericks being preemptive on some closeouts. I know that they ended up fouling, I want to say it was it Buddy Hield? Yes, it was Buddy Hield that got fouled twice shooting threes. Tim Hardaway Jr., I remember, was on the closeout one of those times. And barring that, the Mavericks, when they had any sort of turnovers or long misses and the Pacers were getting out in transition, they were just fouling a little more heavily than you'd like them. You'd like to have the ability to contest without fouling as much. Christian Wood, I think he picked up 4 personal fouls tonight. Maybe it was 5. Let me check. He ended up having 4, but 2 of them were very dumb fouls by him in the fourth quarter that we'll get into here momentarily. But yeah, the Mavericks, their perimeter defense, I didn't think was too terrible to, really open the gates in that first quarter. Particularly, they just had a struggle defending that pick and roll, particularly with, Reggie Bullock as the point of attack defender on Haliburton, and, Dwight Powell obviously just being indecisive when having to guard Miles Turner in those instances. But, both of those guys are uber talented offensive players. So it's a tough ask, for the Mavericks to be able to do that. So I don't want to blame them too heavily, but at the same time, we do have to provide constructive criticism for their inconsistencies in that department. I thought that, like I said, I thought there were some times, particularly like Justin Holiday, he had some really good plays where he rotated over to his guy. Well, he a large portion of this game, he was guarding either like Nembhard or Aaron Nesmith or Buddy Hield. He was kind of, just running around the perimeter guarding a lot of those shooters. But particularly at the point of attack with Haliburton, the Mavericks just did not have many answers for that. And, there were some times in the second half where the Mavericks did a good job of trapping late on Haliburton and kind of forcing the issue at the point of attack, particularly like when Maxi got switched onto a couple of the Pacers smalls. I don't think that they necessarily thought or predicted that he was as good as he was defensively. Rick Carlisle should have informed his guys that, this white guy from Germany can actually, anchor down and play some perimeter defense. But unfortunately for the Pacers, that is, they didn't seem to understand that. So, I think that was a big part of the Mavericks also kind of getting things going a little bit defensively in that fourth quarter. But otherwise, that first half was, dominated by the Pacers' spacing that they were able to create on offense, the threes that they got because of it, and, maybe a couple ticky-tacky fouls, but also the Mavericks being a little lackadaisical on their rotations in terms of their perimeter defense, just kind of being behind the curve and, allowing a lot of transition opportunities to the Pacers, which were forcing the Mavericks by virtue of that to overfoul. So I think the Pacers ended up finishing 31 of 40 on free throws in this one, and they had like 20-something free throws in the first half. So that in itself is not a good marker. But moving on to the second half, the Mavericks in that third quarter ended up scoring 39 points, but contrary to them, the Pacers ended up having 37. So it didn't necessarily remediate the defensive woes that the Mavericks were having. But in that third quarter, the Mavericks had a very solid second half shooting barrage from Hardaway and Reggie Bullock. And I honestly thought that it was because they were being benefactors of the space that Kyrie and Luka were creating. The Mavericks are running a lot of horn sets. They were able to counteract the Pacers, who were doubling Luka and Kyrie. There were a lot of 4-on-3 scenarios kind of created in that second half. Now, I thought Rick Carlisle did a really masterful job in terms of the timing of some of those doubles that the Pacers were able to institute, but they were half court pressing the Mavericks at time, or full court pressing the Mavericks at times for that matter. And it was able to lead to some wide open shots when the Mavericks were able to break the press. There were a couple times that Indiana was really able to get behind the curve. They didn't necessarily create a ton of turnovers, but they were able to wind the shot clock down because their ability to hedge and recover when they were pressing and things of that nature. But the Mavericks, I thought, particularly when Luka and Kyrie had the ball, that they did a good job diagnosing what the defense was giving them and making the right reads accordingly in that third quarter and early fourth quarter. And it ended up eventually, particularly out of those horn sets, when you have two guys screening at the up at the point of attack, and then they dissipate from there on out and end up rotating, either one of them rolls and goes to the corner, or vice versa, things of that nature. There's just a lot of optionality out of that set, and the Mavericks have obviously ran it a lot all season, and they were getting a lot of wide open threes in the corner because of it, particularly with Hardaway and Bullock. And then the Mavericks actually got out to running. I thought the Mavericks, they kind of matched the pace of play of the Pacers in this one. Indiana played pretty fast. They, on like any above the break threes that the Mavericks took that bounced out really far, the Pacers got the rebound. They were running and gunning, and the Mavericks to an extent matched energy. Even Luka was out and running pretty well. So I thought that they were able to do that pretty good, and that definitely helped them get out in transition and create some wide open threes, which was nice. But the defensive woes were only amplified in that second half, just in terms of that Haliburton and Turner pick and roll. But the Mavericks even seemed to get a little more lackadaisical, I thought, in the third and fourth quarter. They were getting blown by a little bit more just on routine, rudimentary, like single dribble blow-bys by the Pacers. We'd see, an Aaron Nesmith or an Andrew Nembhard be able to kind of just glance by whatever Mavericks defender. And I mean, at that point, that kind of just comes down to effort, and they got to get a little bit better at that, especially when you're trailing behind a team that is 8 games under, or now only 7, but at the time, 8 games under 500 at this juncture in the season with only 19 games left. I mean, you got to provide a little bit more effort, and they seemingly just didn't do that for whatever reason. But nonetheless, that obviously takes us to the fourth quarter, where Doncic and Irving played pretty well down the stretch, particularly Kyrie in those non-Luka minutes. He actually, after not necessarily being too much of an aggressor this game, appeared to take heat in that fourth quarter, was, really being a really good facilitator in that fourth quarter when he got trapped, as well as, just going to Kyrie ISO ball haven when it was warranted and being able to create for himself in the mid-range. And the Mavericks ended up winning the fourth quarter 24-18. And they kind of had a tough time at the beginning of this fourth quarter. They were conceding a lot of frees and things like that to the Pacers, a lot of open looks, but the Pacers were kind of missing some stuff, and the Mavericks got lucky on a few shots. And then towards the last 6 minutes, you could definitely see that there was a shift in the Mavericks in terms of their rotational defense, and they just seemed a little bit more in scramble mode. They need to be like that for the whole game. I know that there's a certain defensive cap with this roster. They don't necessarily have the personnel to maybe be a top 10 defense. But I mean, they can certainly be top 15, if everything clicks right and the rotations are on point and things of that nature. But we'll get into the rotations a little bit later. But that, the Mavericks were able to, catalyze and really have a pretty fruitful defensive effort within those last 6 minutes. But it was to no avail, as for whatever reason, their shot making kind of stalled out in those waning moments of the game. Kyrie missed a few. I thought Luka did relatively well down the stretch, but he really didn't have the ball in his hands a whole lot. They were kind of trading off possessions, but Luka had one of those threes at one point within the last 6-7 minutes of the game to cut the lead to 7. The Mavericks were down by 10 or something, so they were kind of playing catch up that whole fourth quarter anyways, just because of the sheer amount of points they had led up to the Pacers all game. But they were able to get back in it, and then it kind of it seemed as if all hope was lost with about 7 seconds left. The Mavericks were down 2, and after a possession in which Tim Hardaway Jr. missed a corner three on the right side of the floor. And Indiana just played really good scramble defense on, the ensuing possession, to which the Mavericks were down 124 to 122. I think it was like with 20 some odd seconds left. And, the Mavericks, you could see they had like a design play, and they were able to get Hardaway that spot up shot in the corner, but just really a scramble defense by the Pacers. They got a good contest on it. And of course, Tim missed it. Indiana got the rebound. The Mavericks fouled Andrew Nembhard after he took some time off the clock. I think they had a foul to give it first, so they fouled somebody, then they fouled him. And Andrew Nembhard went to the line, and he missed both of his free throws with 7.1 seconds left. He's not a guy who shot a heavy dosage of free throws this year, so fortunately he missed both of them. And the Mavericks then ended up getting the rebound. Of course, they call a timeout. There was some debate whether they should have took a timeout in that scenario. I don't have any gripes with it, especially since Kyrie was out of the game for defensive reasons after Tim had missed that shot. So that was kind of what it was in my opinion. But nonetheless, the ensuing play, the Mavericks draw it up for Kyrie. He gets the ball at the left wing, typically where we see Luka take those step back threes, and he ended up dribbling into a step back three to try to win the game down by 2. Now, I mean, you can debate whether the Mavericks should have got off a better shot in that scenario. And I know we've had our gripes with Luka and Kyrie in terms of some of the clutch time woes as of recent. But, particularly in this instance, I mean, I thought it was a good look. Kyrie did a really good job creating space for himself. I believe it was on TJ McConnell where he shot that step back three on. But nonetheless, it went off the front rim and the Mavericks lost. And I think that, particularly in that scenario, obviously that design of that play was probably attributed to Jason Kidd. And I don't know if he, there's been some credence to the fact that he's, over the course of his coaching career, just kind of lets whatever star players on the team just go try and make that shot. He doesn't necessarily draw up plays. And that very well could be the case. I mean, I think in a scenario like that, you may have to draw something up to, try, particularly when you're at home, you're not on the road, you're not trying to steal one, like try to draw something up to where you can tie the game instead of necessarily having to divert to winning it. But I mean, it was a good look. I don't know how many gripes or just general bouts I necessarily have about that play. Particularly, I thought the Mavericks lost this one with their overarching defensive effort over the whole game. But if I have to be nitpicky, I probably would have liked them to have shot a 2 in that instance or got something closer to the rim, having only been down 2 after that. Those Nembhard free throws, but in terms of the actual look that Kyrie got, I don't really have any gripes with it. If anything, at the end of the day, it would come down to coaching and just drawing up a better play in that instance specifically. But yeah, Mavericks ended up losing the game in that sort of heartbreaking fashion in a stretch with, I guess there was 20 games left before this game started, and now 19 games left where they sorely need to start winning because, you do the Kyrie trade and you go all in. And that is sort of just the nature of the situation. They have to get their, for lack of a better term, they have to get their shit together, or else this is going to be a long last 19 games. And I mean, they're packed very densely within this Western Conference. They're now 7th in the West, and they could, within literally a couple losses and a couple wins, could be out of the play-in tournament. They could be like where the Lakers are at right now. So, I mean, this is a very sticky situation with a lot of teams very densely packed together in this conglomerate that is the Western Conference playoff race. And the Mavericks are not necessarily having the best of time trying to move up in the standings at the moment. So we'll have to see what happens. But the direction of this team in terms of everything is just very wishy-washy at the moment. There obviously are going to be the, sort of indictments upon Luka and Kyrie by the national media and talking heads and things of that sort. But at the end of the day, the biggest issues with this team kind of come down to, figuring out the rotation and what's that's going to be. And more so than that, the perimeter, and even grander than that, the interior defensive woes that persists within this team, because it severely handicaps what they can do just from a roster construction standpoint when you're not able to defend the rim in the modern NBA. And the Mavericks are kind of hard pressed to do so on a consistent basis. Maxi can help with some of those woes, and Christian Wood occasionally has his good games there, but they're definitely not cure-alls to say the least. So we'll just have to kind of see how this situation evolves over the course of the next 19 games. But, I posed a question at the beginning of the pod, is the Mavericks season in jeopardy? And I'll tread lightly on the fact that I would say it may not, I don't think their season's in jeopardy yet, but there is cause for concern that it's getting there. I would say that much, to say the least. And who knows exactly what happens, but they need to figure it out is all I'm going to say. But let's get into some of the performances of how everybody fared on, both the Mavericks and the Pacers side. We already kind of talked about Luka, of course. I'll definitely delve a little bit more into Kyrie in this instance. There's obviously been a lot of discourse about him not being aggressive enough, particularly in the non-Luka minutes. And I do think that there's some credence to that. He had some post-game comments we'll get into at the end of the podcast. But at the end of the day, he is making the right plays on offense. He is definitely imposing himself as more of a facilitator than I probably conceived that he would before he came to the Mavericks. There were definitely a few instances where he passed out of shots and things of that nature that were a little bit surprising to me. But he's creating good space for himself. And a lot of people on Twitter have kind of came at me for saying that Luka and Kyrie are gelling well together just because Kyrie necessarily hasn't, maybe came into himself. He's had a few great games at the Mavericks. We look back at that 26-point fourth quarter that he had a few games ago, and some of these other performances. Particularly in those first two games without Luka, he played great, amazing. And I think that he can easily get back to that. This could just be a little rough slump. Everybody goes through slumps. It's literally just been 2 games versus, both the Pacers and the Lakers where he hasn't done the best. But, I think he could serve to be more of an aggressor at the end of the day. But that's not negating the fact that him and Luka do gel well together, because just by virtue of namesake and how much attention they command on the floor and the pressure that they put at the point of attack on the defense, they're creating a lot of space, and this offense still ebbs and flows very well, just with their inclusion on the floor at the same time together. And you see that when the Mavericks are running those horn sets with both of them in the game together and one of them screening. The Mavericks are able to create a lot more looks for everybody else. So the offense still is great with both of them on the floor. And so I would say that they gel together well. They're probably still trying to figure out and fine tune some of the intricacies in terms of, some of those direct actions that they run with each other, whether, it's Kyrie or Luka screening for each other, running certain actions where, one of them is coming off ball, or one screens for the other off ball. There's a lot of different other things that they have yet to kind of tap into. We're seeing some of it, particularly in that Lakers game. We saw them run some, staggers for Kyrie with Luka as the, lead ball handler, things of that nature. But there's obviously some more that they can kind of tap into that I'm pretty excited to see. But nonetheless, Kyrie could definitely serve to be more of an aggressor, but the offense still is working well. Once they really fine tune some of the intricacies of, splitting their shot diet up a little bit better, running some of those actions to a premium a little bit more, then I think that we're really going to see the full dynamism of their fit together. Because they fit well offensively together. They're two great lead ball handlers that can get their guys open shots in their spots, and as well as great offense for themselves, as good as anybody in the NBA. So I don't have any cause for concern in terms of how they fit together, just maybe fine tuning some things. And Kyrie, I don't know if it's just a little slump for him, but maybe just getting an increased shot diet for him. I don't know if it's a confidence thing, who knows, but I'd like to see him be a little bit more aggressive, especially in those non-Luka minutes. He went 7 for 18 for tonight. He shot the second most attempts on the team, but there were some possessions where you thought he probably could have served to take over a little bit more, but I don't think that that's necessarily the reason the Mavericks lost in that game. And it's obviously because of their defense. But getting on to others in this game, Dwight Powell only played 12 minutes in this game. The Mavericks definitely deferred to Maxi and Christian Wood over him a little bit more in this one for whatever reason. We've seen Dwight Powell be the sort of mainstay and the starting five for the Mavericks, who's played the most minutes as of recently, but for whatever reason in this game, I don't know if it's because of Miles Turner. I think that that's my underlying suspicion, and just the fact that Dwight Powell got in foul trouble once we got to that. Or he didn't get in foul trouble. Never mind. I didn't check that. Oh, he got hurt. That's what it was. He got hurt late in that fourth quarter. He got a knee to the groin, and that subsequently caused Maxi to come in and play the waning minutes of the fourth quarter. And it was interesting. The Mavericks kept Powell out of this one a little bit more. And, that's probably where you'd like him to be relegated, as to maybe that third big man in the rotation behind Wood and Maxi. And I mean, I think just dependent on, unless they're playing Wood and Maxi together, I don't necessarily have any gripes with Maxi starting over Wood whenever we get to that point, because I mean, I think that the defensive versatility Maxi is going to be able to provide consistently, at least, is going to be, far and above Wood, just from the standpoint that Wood can provide that, but only in spurts, right? And so I'm okay with that, but the whole Powell Wood thing is a really confusing thing. But Powell, for whatever reason, does have much better advanced stats, and the Mavericks perform better with Powell on the floor versus Christian Wood, which is interesting in terms of some lineup data. So that's a whole nother thing to get into. But I thought Dwight Powell himself played pretty well in his minutes in this one. He did a good job rolling, trying as hard as he could to limit Miles Turner, but he just simply didn't have the wherewithal or the ability to flip his hips or the defensive versatility to do it. And I mean, there were a couple times where he did a good job rim rolling and running the floor when the Pacers half court pressed. I know Christian Wood gave him an easy dunk when they went to some of those two big lineups in the end of the third quarter scenarios. But barring that, pretty stereotypical Dwight Powell game. Missed a couple bunnies, made a few nice, dunks by just maintaining his position in the dunker spot, and played pretty lackluster defense, even if he did try hard. But there were a few plays where he got switched on the smalls. There was one play late in the fourth quarter where he was on Haliburton, where he had a really good contest on him. And there were, I think he got a steal tonight. He did a good job rotating. So there were a few times where he was able to clamp up, as, his effort is going to be able to lead him into those situations more often than not. But, just as a defensive player, just in terms of how he operates, it's obviously going to be a little bit harder for him to stop any guys one-on-one and things of that nature. But I mean, his team defense obviously is invaluable for what it's worth, right? So I thought he played okay. Reggie had a great game tonight from a shooting perspective. He obviously had trouble stopping that pick and roll, as would a lot of point of attack defenders in the NBA would, but he went 5 for 9 from the field, 4 for 8 from 3. He had a great job shooting tonight, and kept the Mavericks in this game throughout a lot of stretches, even if the defense didn't necessarily get back to on par till maybe the third and fourth quarter. I saw him get finally a few more stops on Haliburton. But he's obviously tasked with a tall order, and he, for the most part, he stepped up to the challenge, even if he didn't necessarily limit Haliburton as much as we'd like. He was able to kind of compensate on the other side of the ball. Justin Holiday, he started this game. We can obviously debate the whole, who should start over him and Josh Green. And, I still vehemently believe it should be Josh Green, but that's besides the fact. He did a pretty good job defensively in this one yet again. Just a great rotational defender. From what it's appeared, he does a really good job just man tracking and being able to stay with guys who are moving off ball. But, he didn't take a whole lot of shots tonight. Went 0 for 3 from the field, went 0 for 2 from 3. Went 0 for 2 from the free throw line, and grabbed a few boards. This wasn't the most prominent Justin Holiday game, but I thought he served as a solid defensive cog for when he was in there. And, I'm happy Josh was able to really establish himself tonight. And, not prove maybe why he should play more, because, I mean, they both provide something valuable to this team. But, he served that he showed that he can be a little more dynamic offensively, right? Justin Holiday, when his shot's going, he's good, but he's not a guy that's going to be able to attack off a closeout or run transition the way in which Josh Green can do. But I mean, he played solid tonight defensively, so I'm not going to knock him too heavily. That's as far as the starting lineup goes. Going to the bench, I obviously talked a lot about Maxi at the beginning, just in terms of his defensive versatility and what that meant to the Mavericks. And, him not obviously being a cure-all to some of these problems, but, he definitely alleviates a lot of the stress. And I don't know what his minutes restriction was tonight, but the Mavericks were kind of forced to go Tim down the stretch during certain points. And I mean, he stepped up to the plate and he played quite well. So I was happy about that. He kind of did as much as he could. He did just a great job rotating. I mean, he guards like 2-3 guys on one possession, which is just wildly impressive. Even if, he's kind of seemed like he lost a step or he wasn't as explosive coming off that hamstring tear. He did a phenomenal job to as best as he could. He knocked out a 3. His offense didn't look terrible tonight. So props to him, man. He played a hell of a game. Christian Wood, this is a sort of interesting situation to get into because he went 5 for 13 tonight, 0 for 5 from 3. But he actually looked fairly well offensively. I thought for what it's worth, he did a good job as much as he could have on Turner. He kind of did look as if he stopped the ball a little bit at times. And, there were a few offensive possessions where you feel like there was a sort of stalemate when he caught it. But, I mean, nonetheless, I thought he did a good job effort-wise. He didn't play terrible defensively in this one. Did a fairly good job rotating and guarding when he had to get matched up on smaller guys, just staying with them, not getting really blown past. But, he had a few fouls early on. And then in that fourth quarter, it really culminated into something bigger than what it could have been when Christian Wood had like 2 very blatant illegal screens in a row. He kind of threw his shoulder into a guy. And this was a game that Jason Kidd was actually playing him a little bit more than we've seen recently. We always, different Mavs fans have their opinions about him and Dwight Powell's minutes, of course, and how those are staggered. But it almost seemed as if Jason Kidd would have been willing to maybe ride him a little bit more down the stretch. But Christian Wood had 2 like blatant illegal screens in a row. He just threw his shoulder into the guy. And, the first one was kind of like, okay, just get your feet set. But the second one, it's like, okay, like how could you not learn from the first one? It was like literally like back-to-back possessions. And, deservingly so, he got subbed out. I wasn't really mad at that decision when Maxi came into the game for him. I know Maxi can set a better screen and he's obviously typically better defensively, but Christian Wood went to the locker room right after. And I guess he was followed by JaVale McGee. He ended up coming back onto the bench, but it was just a weird scenario. And I don't know if that, typifies him not, being pissed off or something of that nature, but it was a whole weird deal. But luckily, I mean, he came back onto the bench, supported the team, but he didn't play for the rest of the game. I don't know. The whole situation in itself is just weird. And we've obviously covered it ad nauseum and what my opinions and Jaron's opinions are regarding the situation, but it is just a sort of unfortunate deal in terms of the way that, both he's kind of operated as well as the Mavericks and their coaching staff and the front office has operated with him. And we're just going to have to see how it evolves over the next 19 games of the playoffs, because at the end of the day, regardless of how you want to twist it, his, offensive prowess and his readiness, and if he can play good defensively, I mean, that matters a lot for the Mavericks. They could easily lose him for nothing this offseason. So, I mean, I know it's not as big of a loss as like Brunson per se, but the Mavericks don't have cap space to just go out and sign another person. So, I hope they don't screw it up from whatever perspective ends up happening, whether that just be somehow facilitating a sign and trade or, if he plays good down the stretch, returning him on another deal or, seeing how he fares with Maxi, especially as Maxi comes up to speed. I think one of the biggest saving graces to Christian Wood's season this year could be him and Maxi's 2-man lineups, because that kind of covers up for some of Wood's defensive lapses. But I guess we'll just have to see how the situation evolves nonetheless down the stretch. Tim Hardaway Jr. had a really good game tonight. He actually played pretty well defensively for, what it's worth in terms of what he can do. He did a good job rotating. There were a few times where he had some over fouls and he was being a little bit preemptive and he kind of got caught ball washing, as he typically has a tendency to do, when he closes out too hard. But he shot the ball well. He had 6 threes that he attempted in this game, and those were all of the field goals he attempted in this game. He made all 4. They made 4 free throws. Had 16 points. I mean, just a really steady game from him. This was exactly what you'd ask for him off the bench. He played 37 minutes in this one, proving as to why his spacing is invaluable. He's become this, more of a consistent guy for the Mavericks as of recent. No matter what role he's sort of in, he's just been playing more consistently for whatever reason. The defense hasn't been as atrocious. There's still the bouts, and, you still maybe would probably label him as an average to, even sometimes below average defensive player, but he's doing a better job rotating as a team defender, and he's hitting his threes, and he's providing that spacing for the Mavericks. And that's something that they sorely need. I mean, obviously you'd like a guy in his position to be able to defend a little bit better, and maybe they can address that this offseason. But I think for what it's worth, he's been playing pretty well. So I was happy with how he played. And it's just not even like the fact that he's playing well. It's the fact that, we've had the whole tendency of Tim Hardaway Jr. to play crazy good for like 2 weeks at a time, and terrible for 2 weeks at a time. But, ever since the trade deadline, it's just been this sort of consistent marker of, their guests, like some games, there'll be some variance in terms of, him being a little bit better in one game versus the other, but overarchingly, he's playing pretty good. So I was happy with that. Josh Green, I thought he did a really good job in his 22 minutes tonight. I thought he should probably got a little bit more. He did about as good of a job at the point of attack on Haliburton as he could have, but I mean, that's just a tough guard in general. Otherwise, he defended everybody else rotationally pretty well. He went 4 for 5 from the field. I'd like to see him be a little bit more aggressive offensively, but at the same, he definitely seems that that's sort of tapered off ever since Jason Kidd took him out of the starting lineup for whatever reason. But he still did a great job cutting, running in transition. He had a thunderous dunk in transition today where, and then he had a nice backdoor cut where he was able to get a little Luka lob that he was able to get up there. So, I mean, he's still making those sort of fill in the gap, utility player plays that are just invaluable that really nobody else kind of provides on this team, just by virtue of his cutting and his savviness moving without the ball and just getting the ball within, finding gaps within, holes of the defense. But at the same time, he only had 22 minutes tonight, but I thought he played really well for what it's worth, got a few really key rebounds for the Mavericks. So he had a pretty solid game, but he definitely wasn't, bringing the ball up the floor as much as we've seen in previous games or facilitating as much offense, but he did come in and provide some stability in those bench lineups for the Mavericks. So I thought that was pretty solid. So that kind of goes, that's kind of as far as the Mavericks play tonight. I thought how all their guys fared. There were some guys better than others, but particularly offensively, there really weren't many gripes with this team. But defensively is where we really need to get into, and that's obviously the Mavericks interior and perimeter defensive woes that continue to persist game after game. I kind of alluded to it when I was talking about some of those guys, but it was just a sort of, the Mavericks obviously don't have the wherewithal or the personnel to be able to remediate those woes entirely, but I thought they did a halfway decent job at points in this game in terms of their perimeter defense. But like I said, particularly in that third quarter, things just veered off to the side for whatever reason, and they started just getting a little more lackadaisical. They were conceding a lot of single dribble blow-bys to guys that they wouldn't stereotypically do it to, like a Aaron Nesmith or Andrew Nemhart, definitely like capable players. But, if you're going to get beat in one-on-one scenarios, you want it to be, at the point of attack, you want it to be like Tyrese Haliburton, because the more role players you can see those easy baskets to, the harder it's going to get for you to win games. So that obviously was cause for concern. And of course, the lack of rim protection. Maxi did a good job rotating for what it's worth, but Miles Turner just put so much pressure on the rim. There was really no answer for him in any sort of aspect. There's a sort of call to action maybe from some people to play JaVale a little bit, which is interesting. And I maybe would tend to agree with that, especially if the Mavericks don't do anything in the buyout market. They have till 12 p.m. Central Time, or no, 12 a.m. Central Time, I believe, on March 1st. So today to do something. But of course, that's going to be conducive to whether they actually decide to do something or not. So we'll just have to see how that situation ends up evolving. But I mean, this team as is well documented, they just have a severe lack of rim protection. And, particularly when Dwight and JaVale are in there, they can do some different things in terms of their team defense. And I said Dwight and JaVale. I meant Dwight and Christian Wood. They can do some different things in terms of Dwight, being a solid team defender, him being stout, especially when the Mavericks went to zone. They went to zone for like a brief period in that first quarter. And Dwight is pretty solid when the Mavericks do that schematically. And Christian Wood, he's able to defend the perimeter decent and occasionally, chase some blocks and do some different things there. But, in terms of, and he's even not a terrible one-on-one defender when he's matched up against some of these big men, but in terms of defending the pick and roll and, being able to provide rim protection when you got a guy coming downhill. Both of those guys just are not capable enough. And then what Maxi is able to provide, especially coming off this hamstring injury right now, just isn't enough to serve as a cure-all for the woes that the Mavericks have. And I mean, the Mavericks also just don't have, some of their wings are maybe good one-on-one perimeter defenders, but they don't really serve as, big enough guys in terms of like Reggie or Justin Holiday that can rotate over and provide that like weak side help in instances where somebody gets beat at the rim. So, I mean, this is obviously their biggest, their biggest sort of failure this season, of course, is the Mavericks rim protection, by virtue of that, JaVale McGee not being exactly what a lot of people may have conceived him to be. And, you want to maybe try him out in some of these instances, but who knows how much it would actually help, of course, right? But because just some of the inconsistencies he's had this year. But, Miles Turner, of course, torched the Mavericks in that department this game. And the perimeter defense, I thought was okay at times. But like I said, in that third quarter, it was just completely lackadaisical, and they were getting beat a lot more often than not. And that was kind of disheartening to see. So you'd like to see them remediate that a little bit in terms of that perimeter defense, in terms of something that they can actually control. But the interior defense, that seems to just be a commonality of it is what it is. Hopefully they can maybe tend to it on the buyout market a little bit, but they're definitely not going to get any sort of cure-all this season by any means. And it sucks. That's why we wish they did something at the trade deadline, but they didn't. So we'll have to see if, just cumulatively by virtue of that sort of scramble perimeter defense, if that can increase that they played last year, that can help resolve the issue a little bit and get them to middle of the pack defensively, as well as, the offense just invigorating some more energy into this team. And if the offense is so good to where it overrides that, that'd be great. But it's just becoming a huge problem right now, right? Otherwise, the Mavericks were plagued by overfouling in this one, as I kind of alluded to in that first half. It got better in the second half, though, for sure. And the Mavericks themselves didn't shoot the best on free throws tonight. They went 18 for 28. A lot of those, I think they made all their second half free throws, but they definitely had some clunky mishaps in terms of the first half and with those free throws. Otherwise, some other different narratives we can maybe get into. Luka's attitude. I know there's been a lot of complaints about that recently. He got a technical in this one. I don't know what his counting is at in terms of how many technicals he'll be at till he gets suspended. I'm assuming he's only a couple off, but obviously there's, especially when we lose the narratives in regards to him being out of shape and him complaining about the refs, they tend to come out a lot more. That's definitely not the highest thing on the totem pole in terms of the Mavericks issues at the moment, but there are obviously things that he could serve to do better at. And I mean, I think he's been in decent shape ever since he came out of the All-Star break. After he came back from his heel injury, there was a little gap there when we played like the Kings and stuff where I thought he may not came in the best shape, but I think he's been in fine shape. And, it's on him to put in a little bit of effort defensively. We've seen that he can be a capable defender at times. He's really stout, even if he doesn't have the foot speed to hang with guys, and he's very savvy in terms of being able to use his hands in different situations. But, he could probably be, give a little more effort on that end at times. I know he is injecting so much effort offensively. That's a tough ask for a guy like that, right? But, there is with the Mavericks defensive woes right now, we need anything we can get. So, you'd hope that he can just expel whatever little more ounce he can defensively from that aspect. And, just in terms of the controllables, he can do a better job of getting back and not complaining to the refs. He always says he's going to do it, but when is he actually going to do it, right? So, seeing his transition defense improve, things of that nature, that's going to be just a maturation process that comes throughout his career. And we see different spurts where he's better at it than others. But I think, as the frustrations with the team boil over, his frustrations with that tend to be a little more uncontrollable for himself. So I think that's just sort of an unfortunate reality, but we'll kind of have to see how that ends up evolving, because that definitely was notable in this game, especially with how much he complained and, got technical and stuff. But it wasn't the main reason for the Mavericks losing, but, he's got to get back on defense a little more, like bottom line. I think that's the biggest thing, take away the out of shape narratives, take away just his one-on-one defense in general. If he can just get back on defense a little more and just be there like that, that would be huge in some of these possessions. That could swing a 2-point game into a win there's a lot of different reasons. That's why the Mavericks lost this game. I'm not saying that that was the reason by any means or the biggest reason, but I'm just saying that it is a fact of life, right? Otherwise, Kyrie Irving said post game in regards to, I don't know, just kind of him being like non-aggressive. I don't know what the exact direct question was to this response, but he said that he maybe had some self-imposed restrictions. I'm quoting that verbatim. I don't know the exact quote. I'd have to go back and look at it. But he said he might have had some like self-imposed restrictions, or he's putting a little pressure on himself in terms of his performance. He's only had a little like rough stretch throughout this like 2-game stretch, but we would like to see him be a little more aggressive offensively, of course. So let's just see how that situation, of course, evolves, because that you could maybe see that coming from him. So it takes a man to admit something like that. So I'm happy that he was admitting to that. But I mean, this is a guy who has a track record of being one of the best ball handlers and shot creators in NBA history. So I'm just not all too concerned about him diverting back to, what he usually is after this little rough 2-game stretch. And, as he becomes more comfortable with the team that he just recently got traded to, taking a little bit more of the shot diet and taking a little bit more of a heat on offense than, he is right now. I mean, a lot of it could just be adapting to a new situation, not wanting to interrupt things too much. And I get that, but he'll recognize at some point he's the best player, or he's the second best player on this team. I mean, I know he already knows that, but he'll know when he needs to take over a little more. That's just my personal opinion. But, if we do see this situation start to evolve for even a couple more games on end, even like 1 or 2 more games on end, then maybe there's credence to the fact that there's something else at play there. So I'll start to question that. But right now I'm gonna withstand from really getting into that sort of stuff. But I at least am happy he was able to bear some admittance to that, and hopefully he can tend to those issues accordingly and kind of figure out and get that confidence back that he sorely needs. But otherwise than that, we can look at a couple guys on the Pacers that I thought fared really well tonight. I thought Aaron Nesmith, for a guy that has in his career not really been stereotypically known as the best defender coming out of college and things of that nature, you can definitely tell he's put on some size since he's been to the league. And I mean, his length is actually serving to play some pretty good defense. I thought he played great rotationally. He actually commits one of the more higher dosage of fouls in the NBA, which is interesting. That's by virtue of that's kind of why he only played 19 minutes tonight. But I mean, he torched the Mavericks tonight from all aspects. He's definitely got better at his dribble drive game. He made 2 threes tonight, so that was nice. I've already talked about Miles Turner and Haliburton ad nauseum, just Haliburton's ability to stop and go and manipulate the pick and roll, and just diagnose pick and roll coverages of the guys going under on a screen, and some of the passes he's able to make within half court settings and some of the actions they run. He had like a spin pass tonight that I think and Miles Turner ended up getting fouled off of. Like that sort of stuff. It's just like, what are you gonna do about that? So I don't even know, man. But he played a hell of a game tonight. Andrew Nembhard, this is a rookie dude who's had some explosive performances this season. Just kind of as his sort of shot creating, but is also like kind of spot up guy for them. Also plays some decent defense, but he didn't have the best offensive game. He just missed a few of his threes, and by virtue of that, but kind of fell out of favor tonight with the Pacers, but still played some decent defense. And he served as a pretty good playmaker, had 5 assists tonight, but he did a good job, just doing whatever he does against the Mavericks as always, which is typically shooting. But in this instance, he got fouled like 3 times taking threes or something of that nature. And he made 7 of 9 of his free throws. So, he's always going to be a threat from the outside, even though he's kind of a defensive black hole. Jordan Nwora, he played great for the Pacers, I think he was on the Bucks before this, I want to say. And he's this sort of dude who is, really decent at defending kind of like 3s and 4s, but he obviously has he's kind of a tweener in a sense where he lacks the ability to guard up on 5s and also can't really sit down and, guard on the perimeter. But, he is a really good shooter. And he can attack off a closeout occasionally. And I mean, he did great off the bench for them. So 16 points, Mavericks had a tough time containing him. TJ McConnell was that sort of savvy presence where he's just so good at dribbling around, really savvy third ball handler. He's got like love for the Mavericks to have. But, it's obvious and just a good team defender for his size. He played some pretty invaluable minutes for them tonight. Chris Duarte, it's interesting. He kind of seems to have fell out of the rotation after being, this really sort of good six-man type of dude, but he only played 7 minutes tonight, went 0 for 2. Was pretty unnoticeable, but they got a lot of guys that kind of play the same position, like just sort of hybrid guards or forwards. So it'll be interesting to monitor what they do with that in their near future, especially as they start to get better, how that situation may start to play itself out with some of those guys maybe getting traded, but that's interesting to say the least. But Benedict Mathurin, he's been coming off the bench all year. Obviously this high profile, two-way, high-flying rookie. And, he had kind of a rough game tonight. He got to the free throw line a couple times. He's really explosive getting to the rim. His three-point shot's good. He's obviously a really stout defender, has the athleticism. He can be a little bit preemptive in a sort of same sort of sense that kind of like Josh Green is in terms of, his ability to kind of anticipate too much and not sit down and, play good on one-on-one defense. He takes some gambles, but he has the tools to be a really good defender at some point, as he was in college. And even so, he still has some good defensive games with those inhibitions that I just mentioned. And even though he didn't have the best offensive game, I really like this guy so far. Just from an on-court perspective, the way that he, plays. And I really like his game, even though some people have some gripes with his off-court stuff. He's a confident dude. I like that. So, I thought he played a hell of a game tonight. And he didn't play a hell of a game tonight, but I thought that for scoring one of his, for going 1 of 7, I still thought he had a pretty immediate impact on the game, even though he wasn't, the, primary scoring option off the bench or wasn't hitting all of his shots as he typically is for the Pacers. But barring that, that's really all I got for this podcast. If we're going to go and answer the centripetal question of is the Mavericks season in jeopardy, just to reiterate, it very well could be, but I don't think it's gotten necessarily to that point yet. And they got to get their shit together sooner rather than later in terms of at least getting this defense to a point where it's comparable to being, close to some of those middle of the pack teams, and, getting the offense to a point where, or just getting the offense to a point where it's just so good that it overrides the defense. One of the two. I don't know if this Mavericks team is a championship contender, but they could at least be a team that makes a decent run in the playoffs, but they're going to have to, they're going to have to get that up and running faster. 7th in the West now. And they could also easily be a team that falls out. This team has had so many questions. We thought that they seemingly kind of threw all those questions out the window once Kyrie came, and they have an identity now, but that may not necessarily be the case. Even if they have a direction, I don't know if they have an identity. And that's a big thing for this team to find, is just what are they? And so we'll see what happens. They play Philly at 6:30 on Thursday at home. Of course, they continue his home stretch, and that's going to be a huge game. This next stretch makes or breaks the season, man. If they lose a few more, they could be out of the play-in game. So it's a sad reality we may have to come to, but I don't know. It's really starting to get scary, guys. And I hope that things end up turning out for the best, but otherwise I will be here. I will continue to cover it for you guys. Of course, Jaron will too when he comes back Thursday night. Barring that, make sure to follow us on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. Make sure to subscribe, comment, and like if you were on the YouTube gang. Shout out to the YouTube gang if you guys are listening on there. We are on YouTube now, of course. Comment if you are on YouTube. What do you think? Do you think Joel Embiid will get into a fight with any Mavericks players on Thursday night? Comment that. Also, otherwise, if you're listening on any other podcast platform, we're on almost every podcast platform, whether it be Anchor or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Make sure to follow us or subscribe on whatever sort of podcast platform it allows you to do so, and whatever, basically, however you have to follow us, just do that if you guys really enjoy our content. We appreciate you guys from listening this far on the podcast. Give us a 5-star rating, of course, as well. Otherwise, we will catch you guys in the next one. Will with Mainstream Mavs signing out. Peace out, guys.